In the early 1980s, hitchhiking and accepting rides still carried a dangerous kind of normality. In small towns across New England, people trusted familiar roads, familiar faces, and the idea that trouble belonged somewhere else. For 15-year-old Laura Sheridan in Berkshire County, Massachusetts, that assumption collapsed on June 23, 1981, during an ordinary trip home. She had come back from Pittsfield and was walking the last stretch from a bus stop along a route she knew well. When a man offered her a ride, it looked like a shortcut, nothing more. The car moved toward her neighborhood, toward the point where she expected the driver to slow and stop. Instead, the vehicle rolled past her home, the driver accelerating away from the place she recognized as safety. Laura reacted fast. She pleaded. She tried to reason with him. Then she saw the moment that confirmed what her instincts were already screaming. The man reached for a gun tucked inside a paper bag. That detail, small and almost absurd, turned the whole scene into something sharp and final. A weapon, hidden in something ordinary, brought out only when control was slipping. Laura fought back. The struggle inside the car was chaotic and desperate, a clash for a single outcome, survival. In that fight, she managed to seize control of the weapon. The driver did not surrender. The car pulled off onto Route 7 near a rest area and stopped. Laura took the only opening she had and ran. She bolted from the vehicle toward the road, screaming for help with the kind of voice people only find when their life is on the line. A passing motorist stopped and helped her to safety. Another person, instead of freezing or driving away, followed the fleeing vehicle and recorded the license plate. That choice, made in seconds, gave police something concrete in a case that could have dissolved into a description and a memory. The suspect was David Allen Morrison. He was charged in connection with the attack, including assault and battery by means of a dangerous weapon and illegal possession of a firearm. But he was acquitted. In legal terms, it meant he walked. In human terms, it meant Laura carried the moment forward while the man she believed tried to kidnap her continued moving through the world. Morrison lived in Vermont, worked in Connecticut, and traveled routes that cut straight through the Berkshires. Over time, he left the region and went to California. He also spent time in the United States Navy. 5 years after Laura's escape, another crime struck Vermont with a similar undercurrent. A woman taken from an ordinary place by force and made to vanish. Sarah Hunter was 32 years old, a golf professional at the Manchester Country Club, respected and well known in her community. She had helped build a junior golf culture and carry the kind of reputation that comes from being consistent, warm, and present. On the evening of September 18, 1986, she left her boyfriend's house intending to go home and study for an upcoming professional certification. She stopped at a gas station in Manchester to buy cigarettes. Morrison was working there. What should have been a brief stop became the last normal choice Sarah ever made. According to the later resolution of the case, Morrison seized Sarah by force, overpowered her, and bound her with rope inside the station. When his shift ended, he forced her into the trunk of his car. He drove her south to a secluded area near Danby, Vermont. There, Sarah was killed with extreme brutality. She was reported missing the next morning on September 19th. Her body was found on November 27th in a wooded area. Morrison was a prime suspect because he worked at the gas station near where her car was found. But investigators could not secure the evidence needed to close the loop. The case hung in that familiar cold case position, strong suspicion, incomplete proof. Years passing, 2 years later, Morrison abducted a woman in California, held her at gunpoint, and forced sexual acts. He was arrested and sentenced to 20 years to life in prison on charges including kidnapping and indecent assault. In 2012, Vermont authorities brought charges in Sarah Hunter's case after DNA testing appeared to link strands of hair from Morrison's car to Sarah. The prosecution was later dropped due to errors in the handling of evidence. That decision cut deep because it meant the case had been within reach and still slipped away. In May 2024, renewed developments in the Laura Sheridan case reignited the effort. A grand jury indictment charged Morrison with the 1981 kidnapping, prompting cooperation across state lines. In the summer of 2024, a former Vermont investigator who had worked the Sarah Hunter case traveled to California to interview Morrison. After decades of denials and legal failures, the pressure returned in a new form. Time had changed the tools, changed the context, changed the people still fighting for answers. The interview broke something open. Morrison confessed. Laura testified to the grand jury. confronting the memory of that day in 1981 with a level of courage that few people understand until they are asked to do it. Her testimony, combined with the renewed push, helped gather threads that had remained loose for decades. On December 9, 2025, in Berkshire Superior Court in Massachusetts, Morrison pleaded guilty to the 1981 kidnapping of Laura and received 2 years to be served concurrently with his existing sentence. Later that same day, in Bennington, Vermont, he appeared again and pleaded guilty to the 1986 murder of Sarah Hunter. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. One survivor's refusal to let the past stay buried became a key force in closing the cases that had defined laws across the states. On July 20, 1990, a farmer working a soybean field near the rural crossroads of Lebanon Road and Troy Fallon Road in Madison County, Illinois, made a discovery that instantly turned a quiet workday into a crime scene. In the tall stalks of beans lay the body of a woman. The violence was obvious. She had been stabbed multiple times. Her body had been left exposed in the open field. The condition of the remains suggested she had been there for about a week before she was found. Investigators believed she was killed somewhere else and then brought to the field, place where the land hid her in plain sight. At the scene, investigators did what they could with what they had. They processed the area and collected evidence, including clothing, shoes, and a ring. The coroner's office kept several items for future identification. The problem was not effort. The problem was identity. Without a name, the case had no entry point into the wider world of missing persons reports, no family to push for answers, and no known last place to start searching. She was estimated to be about 30 years old. She became a file, a photograph, a description, and then a cold case over the years. Law enforcement revisited the case again and again. They generated sketches. They reached out to other agencies. They checked missing person reports that might match. Nothing connected. In 2007, the FBI created a clay reconstruction showing what the woman might have looked like in life, hoping someone would recognize her. Still no match. For more than 3 decades, she existed publicly as Jane Doe, a victim known by the fact of her death, rather than the truth of her life. The cold case reality is that time usually destroys cases. Witnesses fade, evidence degrades, details vanish. This case survived because pieces were preserved. Eventually, technology changed the meaning of preservation. In late 2024, Madison County authorities reopened the investigation and worked with state resources and advanced DNA methods that were not available in 1990. Preserved DNA could now do more than exclude suspects. It could reach outward through distant family lines, tracing relationships, building a family tree, turning biology into a roadmap. The work was slow and demanding. It required genealogical research that connected partial matches, distant cousins, and branches that had moved across states. But it worked. On July 1, 2025, almost exactly 35 years after her body was found, officials announced that Jane Doe had a name, Winona Nadine Wendy Michelle. Her biography came back in pieces, as many biographies do when a person disappears for decades. She was born on August 23, 1959, in Los Angeles, California. Her life involved movement. As a child, her family relocated to Tennessee. In her late teens, she traveled to Florida. Then she went back west to California during the early 1980s. She was a mother of 2. In April 1990, she and her children traveled by bus to Nashville, Tennessee, where she left the children with relatives. In May, family members saw her in the Washington, D.C. area. That was the last confirmed sighting. At that meeting, she was reportedly with a man described only as a truck driver. After that, she vanished from contact and from record for her family. The disappearance did not immediately carry the clear alarm it would later have. Wendy was known to travel and sometimes go weeks or months without contact. That pattern can blur the line between free choice and danger, and it can delay the moment when relatives realize they are not dealing with distance, but with disappearance. Over time, the silence grew suspicious. With the identification now public, her brother described the emotional impact, devastation at the brutality, anger at the unknown person who did it, and grief that she died alone in a field far from anyone who knew her name. Identification is not the same as justice, but it changes everything. It transforms a case from an anonymous murder into a personal homicide with a measurable timeline and real relationships. It also sharpens the unanswered questions into a clear set of investigative targets. where Wendy traveled between May and July 1990, who the man with her in Washington was, how she reached Illinois, and who stabbed her and dumped her body in a soybean field. The Madison County Sheriff's Office has continued to appeal for information that could lead to an arrest and prosecution. After 35 years of anonymity, the victim is no longer Jane Doe, she is Wendy, and her story is finally anchored to a name. Michelle Marie Newton's case begins in Louisville, Kentucky, in the spring of 1983, inside what looked like a family preparing for a normal transition. Michelle was 3 years old. Her parents were Deborah Lee Newton and Joseph Joe Newton. The plan, at least as Joe understood it, was a move to Georgia. Moves are noisy but ordinary, boxes, schedules, a sense of tomorrow. On the morning of April 2nd, 1983, Deborah left early with Michelle. She told Joe she was going to head to prepare the new home and start work. Later, when Joe arrived, both Deborah and Michelle were gone, and they never checked in again. That day became the last day Joe lived in the same reality as his daughter. Law enforcement issued missing child alerts and warrants for Deborah's arrest. For custodial interference, Deborah became a fugitive. At one point, she was listed among the most wanted parental kidnapping fugitives. Years passed with no confirmed sightings, no solid trace, no clear destination. Cases like this do not only steal a child, they steal a father's ability to grieve cleanly. When there is no body, no proof of life, and no message, every year becomes a loop of hope, dread, and helplessness. Over time, even active cases can collapse under the weight of missing information. By 2000, investigators could not get accurate contact information for Joe and could not follow up on leads. The case was dismissed. In 2005, with Michelle still unlocated and records stale, she was removed from national missing child databases. That detail matters because it shows how a missing child can be lost twice, once by the abduction, and again by the slow failure of systems that are not built to chase the same trail for decades. In 2016, after relatives urged police to look again, the case was reopened, but it still produced no solid location for Deborah or Michelle. Then, in 2024, a major new push was made. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released an age progression image of what Michelle might look like as an adult. Around age 45, age progressions are a form of public pressure. They turn private tragedy into a face the public might recognize, and they create the conditions where one tip can unlock the case. In 2025, that tip arrived through Crime Stoppers. Someone in the Villages, Florida recognized a woman from public notices and alerted authorities. A task force detective compared current photos to old images of Deborah Newton and found a strong likeness. DNA testing, including a sample from Deborah's sister, produced a match. The name Sharon nearly fell apart. Deborah was living under an alias, telling neighbors that police attention must be a prank, until officers confronted her with the old warrant. She was arrested and later extradited to Kentucky. The most surreal part of the case was not Deborah's arrest. It was what happened next. Officers went to the door of the woman living in Florida and delivered a sentence that destroys a lifetime of assumptions. She was not who she thought she was. She was Michelle Marie Newton, missing since she was a toddler. Michelle reportedly had no idea she had been missing. She had grown up under a different name, lived an entire adult life, and had children of her own. That means the abduction did not only remove her from her father, it erased her own access to her origins. Once the truth surfaced, plans were made for reunion. In December 2025, Michelle reunited with her father, more than 40 years after he last saw her as a 3-year-old. A reunion like that is not a simple happy ending. It is a collision between the timelines, a father whose life has been shaped by absence, and a daughter whose identity has been shaped by a lie she never chose. Michelle has spoken about wanting to support both parents and help with healing as the legal process unfolds. A complex position that shows how parental kidnapping can create moral and emotional damage that does not fit into easy roles. Deborah, 66 years old, was arraigned in Louisville on a felony custodial interference charge related to taking her daughter in 1983. Under Kentucky law, there is no statute of limitations for this crime, meaning the state can prosecute despite the decades that passed. Deborah has been released on bond and pleaded not guilty as proceedings continue. The case remains both a legal story and a human story, a child taken, a father left behind, and a woman forced to rebuild her identity after learning her real name decades too late. On February 19, 1986, investigators in Placer County, California found portions of a human skull along Dry Creek, near Booth Road in unincorporated Roseville. The remains were partial, fragmented, and anonymous. In that era, DNA analysis was not a practical tool for routine identification, and the case stayed in limbo, without a full set of remains, without a known missing person match, and without a clear cause of death. The evidence became something stored rather than something solved. Cases like this are uniquely difficult because they start with the end. A missing person case begins with a name and tries to find a location. A remains case begins with a location and tries to find a name. When only partial remains exist, investigators may not be able to determine how the person died, whether foul play occurred, or even exactly when death occurred. The unknown becomes a wall. Decades later, the Placer County Cold Case team took advantage of advancements in DNA technology to re-examine cases previously thought unsolvable. The team submitted the skull fragments to the California Department of Justice for modern analysis. This step reflects a larger shift in cold case work. Evidence that once served only as a grim artifact can now become a living investigative tool. DNA can pull a person out of anonymity by connecting them to relatives, even when the remains are incomplete. In December 2025, the Placer County Sheriff's Office announced that DNA analysis identified the remains as belonging to Marjorie Linehan. Marjorie was 49 years old when she disappeared on October 1st, 1982 in Sacramento County, California. The timeline matters. It suggests that the remains, found in 1986, may have been connected to a disappearance that had already been unresolved for years. Officials stated that no foul play was suspected at the time of her disappearance, and that no cause of death could be determined from the partial remains. That detail creates a particular kind of closure and a particular kind of frustration. For families, identification can be a final answer to the question of where their loved one went, but it can also introduce new uncertainty about what happened in the final days. Without more remains or additional evidence, investigators cannot definitively label the case as homicide, accident, or something else. The legal system may never be able to provide a narrative as clear as families want. Still, identification is powerful. It is the difference between a person being lost to history and being returned to it. Marjorie is no longer an unknown skull fragment on an evidence shelf. She is a woman with a name, an age, a disappearance date, and people who knew her. Her family described her as an avid skier, a talented artist, and a mother. Those details matter because they restore dimension. They push back against the way cold cases can flatten victims into headlines. The Placer County Sheriff's Office also described a broader effort behind the work, including the creation of a foundation to support DNA testing, forensic analysis, and investigative work. That context explains why more identifications are happening now. When agencies commit resources to old evidence, names can come back, even when the cause of death cannot be determined. The act of identification gives a family the dignity of certainty about who was found, and it closes the most painful loop of all, not knowing. Jennifer Joyce Kess disappeared in Orlando, Florida, in January 2006 at 24 years old. She was living the kind of life that usually leaves clear patterns, a job, routines, people who expected to hear from her. Jennifer had graduated in finance from the University of Central Florida in 2003. She was a finance manager at a timeshare company and had recently purchased a condo, a milestone that signaled stability. The weekend before she vanished, she had been on vacation with her boyfriend, Rob Allen. In St. Croix, she returned home, spoke with family, and talked with her boyfriend that evening. The last known call to Rob was around 10 o'clock at night. On the morning of January 24th, Jennifer did not make the usual contact. She did not send her normal morning text or call. She did not appear at work. That break in routine alarmed her loved ones because it was not a small change. It was a violation of who she was. Her employer contacted her parents. Her father, Drew Kess, immediately tried calling her, relying on a family rule that they always answered each other's calls. Her phone went straight to voicemail. He knew something was wrong. Drew and his wife Joyce drove from Tampa to Orlando. Inside Jennifer's condo, the scene did not look like a planned disappearance. Items were left out in a way that suggested she had been getting ready. At the same time, key things were missing, including her car and personal belongings. The family reported her missing, and the investigation began, but the early response, as her father later described it, felt dismissive. In cases like Jennifer's, time matters. Hours matter. The first assumptions can set the tone for everything. 2 days later, on January 26th, a tenant at a nearby apartment complex noticed a car that had been parked for several days. It was Jennifer's black 2004 Chevrolet Malibu, found about a mile from her condo. Security footage showed the car being parked and a person exiting and walking away. The face was obscured, and the person remained unidentified. The footage became one of the most frustrating artifacts in modern true crime. Proof that someone moved her vehicle, but not enough detail to prove who. Investigators found no definitive forensic evidence in the car that resolved the case. They also faced practical problems: incomplete security records from Jennifer's condo complex, and limited footage because cameras had not yet been installed in key areas. Another troubling detail was the report that a set of keys to the complex had been stolen a month earlier, raising concerns about access. Photos documented markings on the hood of Jennifer's car that could indicate a struggle, but a single possible sign of conflict is not the same as a usable lead. Over the years, theories multiplied. Some focused on the possibility that Jennifer was abducted while walking to her car or entering it. Others pointed toward the construction and maintenance environment around the condo complex, where renovations were underway and women had reported uncomfortable encounters. There were also broader fears, including the idea of trafficking, because the case had so little physical evidence and such a clean disappearance. Extensive searches were conducted early on, using multiple resources, but no trace of Jennifer was found. As time passed, the case became both famous and frozen. Rewards were offered. Media attention surged and receded. The family pushed and pushed, determined not to let the case disappear the way Jennifer did. In 2016, Jennifer was legally declared deceased by the state due to the prolonged absence of contact, a legal status that does not explain what happened but reflects that years had passed. Without any sign she was alive, the family later pursued access to investigative records and obtained a large volume of documents through a settlement in 2019, which allowed them to see more of what had been done and what had not. In November 2022, Florida's state-level law enforcement took over the case, reflecting a continuing effort to find direction after local leads cooled. In October 2025, Jennifer's father announced that investigators had found new DNA evidence that was previously untested and that the list of persons of interest had been greatly reduced. He also described new attempts to use modern enhancement methods on existing visual evidence, focusing on details that could help identify the person seen near Jennifer's car. The key point is that the case is considered active again, fueled by the idea that modern testing and focused suspect lists can accomplish what earlier years could not. Jennifer Kess's story remains devastating because it has never fully crossed into a final category. It is not solved. It is not forgotten. It is a case where there is a known last routine, a known missing morning, a known recovered car, and known footage of an unknown person. It sits in that narrow space where resolution feels possible, but justice still has not arrived.